when the glass shattered. On the coldest night, the blizzard that hit the North Carolina mountains that February night was the kind that makes old folks tell stories for years to come. But what happened inside that roadside diner? What came crashing through that plate glass window in a shower of ice and fury? That's the kind of story people struggle to believe, even when they saw it with their own eyes. A full-grown bobcat, wild, bleeding, standing in the middle of a crowded restaurant with a state trooper's gun pointed right at its skull. Everyone frozen, everyone certain they were about to witness something terrible. But the bobcat didn't attack. Didn't go for the screaming woman or the overturned tables or the waitress standing in a pool of spilled coffee. It walked straight past all of them, glass crunching under its paws, and stopped at the feet of a 73-year-old man who hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks and was planning to sign away everything he owned the very next morning. When Caleb's shaking hands found that lightning-shaped scar on the creature's back leg, when he whispered a name he hadn't said out loud in 12 years, something passed between them that had nothing to do with logic or reason or anything the other people in that diner could understand. This is the story of what brought them to that moment, of the betrayal that tore them apart, of the promise that survived when everything else burned to ash, and of the legacy they left behind that proved some bonds, once forged in blood and sacrifice, never really break at all. They just wait, patient as mountains, fierce as winter storms, until the moment comes to prove that love, real love, doesn't care about species or time or even death itself. It just endures. The blizzard came like an apocalypse across the North Carolina mountains, turning the world into a howling white void where nothing living should venture. Inside the roadside diner, the fluorescent lights flickered with each gust that slammed against the building, and the handful of late-night travelers huddled over their coffee cups, grateful for the warmth and the illusion of safety. Caleb sat alone at the far end of the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold an hour ago. At 73, he had the kind of face that looked carved from the same mountains he'd spent his life in, all hard angles and deep lines that spoke of too many seasons spent outdoors and too many nights spent alone. His flannel shirt hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful, and his boots were the kind you didn't see anymore. Hand-stitched leather that had been resoled so many times the original craftsman wouldn't recognize them. The young waitress had stopped asking if he wanted a refill. She'd learned months ago that old Caleb came in on nights like this not for the coffee, but because the empty house waiting for him in the woods was somehow worse than sitting among strangers who whispered about him when they thought he couldn't hear. Crazy old Caleb, they said. Hermit who talks to trees. Lost his mind when his wife died. Let them whisper. He'd stopped caring what people thought the day he buried Sarah 12 years ago. The wind screamed, and then came a sound like a gunshot. The plate glass window exploded inward in a shower of crystalline shards that caught the fluorescent light and scattered it across the black and white checkered floor like stars falling to earth. The cold rushed in with physical force, knocking over chairs and sending napkins swirling through the air like confused birds. But it wasn't the wind that had shattered the window. A woman screamed. A man knocked over his table, scrambling backward. The state trooper who'd been finishing his pie had his service weapon out before the glass had finished falling, both hands steady on the grip, finger on the trigger. In the jagged opening where the window used to be stood a bobcat, not a house cat that had wandered in from the storm, not some half-starved juvenile looking for scraps. This was a full-grown North American bobcat, 40 pounds of muscle and fury, with tufted ears laid flat against its skull and eyes that caught the diner's light and threw it back like molten amber. Its fur was thick with ice crystals that hadn't melted, giving it the appearance of something conjured from the storm itself. a spirit of winter given teeth and claws. The animal's lips pulled back in a snarl that showed every tooth, and a low rumble came from its chest that you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. Blood streaked its right shoulder, where it had crashed through the glass, dark against the tawny fur, dripping onto the floor in rhythmic drops that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. Everyone froze. The trooper's aim never wavered, centered on the bobcat's skull. His voice came out steady, the kind of calm that only comes from training. "Nobody move. Don't look it in the eye. I'm going to put it down clean." But the bobcat wasn't looking at the trooper. It wasn't looking at the screaming woman or the man who'd upended his table or the waitress who'd dropped an entire pot of coffee and stood in the spreading pool like she'd forgotten how to move. It was looking at Caleb. The old man felt it before he saw it, that prickling awareness that comes from being watched by something that knows how to kill. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head. His Parkinson's made his hands shake on a good day. But in this moment they went perfectly still, locked around the coffee mug like it was the only real thing in the world. The bobcat took a step forward. Glass crunched under its paws. The trooper's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said don't move." But the bobcat moved anyway, lowering its head, shoulders rolling with each deliberate step. It crossed the diner floor like it owned the place, like every person in that room existed only as background noise to whatever purpose had driven it through a plate glass window in the middle of a blizzard. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd lived in these mountains his whole life, had encountered black bears and rattlesnakes, and once, memorably, a mountain lion. He knew wild things. He knew the weight of a predator's gaze, knew the difference between an animal that was afraid and one that wasn't. This one wasn't afraid. It stopped 3 feet from where Caleb sat, so close he could see the individual whiskers on its face, could count the darker spots on its coat beneath the ice, could smell the wild scent of it, like pine sap and blood and something older than words. The rumble in its chest never stopped, but the quality changed, became something less like a threat and more like something else entirely. And then it lowered its head to Caleb's boots. Not lunging, not attacking, just lowering, the way a dog might, until its scarred nose almost touched the cracked leather. The diner held its collective breath. Somewhere in the back, someone was crying. The trooper had adjusted his aim, trying to get a clean shot that wouldn't hit the old man. "Sir," he said, his voice tight. "Sir, I need you to stay absolutely still." But Caleb wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had locked onto something, and the world narrowed to a single point of impossible recognition. Moving with the kind of slow care you use around sleeping children or loaded weapons, he leaned forward. His right hand, the one that shook so badly most mornings he couldn't button his own shirt, reached out steady as stone. The bobcat didn't move, didn't flinch. Let those trembling fingers touch its back leg, just above the paw, where the fur grew differently, where a scar ran in a jagged line, raised and pale against the tawny coat, shaped exactly like a bolt of lightning. Caleb's breath caught. The world tilted. 12 years fell away like snow sliding off a roof, and he was somewhere else, when else, holding a different kind of broken thing in his hands. His voice came out ruined, barely more than a whisper. But in the perfect silence of that frozen moment, it might as well have been a shout. "Echo?" The bobcat's rumble changed again, became something that no wild thing should be able to make. Something caught between a growl and a sob. A sound of recognition that spoke of memory and loss and impossible distances crossed. It dropped to its belly at Caleb's feet, massive head pressed against his worn boots, and the ice in its fur began to melt in the diner's warmth, pooling on the floor like tears. The trooper lowered his gun slowly, his face slack with confusion. The other patrons stared, moving from terror to something approaching awe, that primitive human understanding that they were witnessing something outside the normal order of things. And Caleb, old, broken Caleb who hadn't cried since they put Sarah in the ground, felt something crack open in his chest. Something he'd thought died in the ashes of a burned workshop 12 years ago. His other hand joined the first, both shaking now but not from disease, running through the wild creature's fur, feeling the reality of it, the impossible miracle of it. "Echo," he said again. And this time it was a prayer, a confession, an apology for every moment since he'd sent it away. The blizzard howled through the shattered window, but neither of them moved. The trooper holstered his weapon, but didn't step back, his training warring with what his eyes were telling him. Around the diner, people began to breathe again, though nobody dared move, as if the wrong sound might shatter whatever strange spell had fallen over the place. Caleb's hands moved through the bobcat's fur with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone whose fingers shook with disease. He found the scar again, traced its jagged path with his thumb, and the animal pressed harder against his touch like it had been waiting 12 years for exactly this. The waitress, a girl named Amy who'd worked there since high school, finally found her voice. "Mr. Caleb, you know this thing?" He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. His throat had closed up with something too big for words. Instead, his fingers kept working, moving down the back leg, feeling where the muscle had healed wrong, where the bone had knitted together at an angle that should have left the animal crippled, but somehow hadn't. The scar wasn't smooth. It was raised and twisted, the kind of mark left by metal that had bitten deep and held on, that had crushed and torn before releasing its grip. Caleb had seen scars like this before, on deer that had escaped leg-hold traps, on dogs that had tangled with barbed wire. But he'd only ever touched one exactly like this. In his mind, unbidden, came the memory of a much smaller creature. Maybe 8 pounds soaking wet, its eyes barely open, mewling in agony as rusted steel teeth held its leg in an embrace that would have meant death if Caleb hadn't found it when he did. "Echo," he whispered again, and the name tasted like smoke and loss and impossible second chances. The bobcat shifted, pulling its head back to look at him directly. Those amber eyes held an intelligence that went beyond instinct, beyond the simple awareness of prey and predator. They held recognition. They held memory. They held grief. Caleb saw it there, in the way the animal's pupils contracted, in the slight tilt of its massive head. It wasn't just that Echo remembered him. It was that Echo remembered everything. The blood, the fire, the last day they'd been together, when Caleb had done the hardest thing he'd ever done and driven this creature away with stones and shouts and a breaking heart. The old man's vision blurred. He tried to speak, to explain, to apologize for all the years between that moment and this one. But what came out was just a broken sound, half sob and half laugh. The trooper cleared his throat. "Sir, I don't know what's happening here, but that's a wild animal, a dangerous one. It came through that window like a freight train." "She came through that window," Caleb corrected, his voice rough, "because she was looking for me." "That's impossible." "Yeah." Caleb ran his palm along Echo's scarred flank, feeling the muscles bunch and relax beneath the wet fur. "Yeah, it is." But impossible or not, here they were. The diner's warmth was melting the ice from Echo's coat now, and pools of water spread across the checkered floor, mixing with the spilled coffee and the blood from her shoulder where the glass had cut her. She needed attention, needed those wounds cleaned and checked. But she made no move to leave Caleb's side. Outside, the blizzard raged on, indifferent to miracles. Inside, something passed between the old man and the wild creature at his feet, something without words, but heavy with understanding. Echo had crossed whatever distance separated them, had fought through a storm that would have killed most things, had shattered glass and her own body to reach him. The question was why? And somewhere in Caleb's chest, beneath the wonder and the joy and the 12 years of carefully maintained loneliness, a cold certainty began to form. She hadn't come back to stay. She'd come back to say goodbye. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and his hands tightened involuntarily in her fur. Echo's rumble changed pitch again, became something almost soothing, as if she could sense the fear rising in him and was trying, in her limited way, to ease it. "How long?" he asked her, knowing she couldn't answer, knowing it didn't matter. "How long have you been out there, watching? Waiting?" The amber eyes blinked slowly. Once, twice. And in that moment, Caleb understood something that made his heart fracture all over again. She'd never really left at all. 12 years earlier, Caleb had been a different kind of broken. Sarah had been gone 3 weeks when he found himself walking the old logging trails behind their property, moving through the October woods with no destination in mind. Just the desperate need to be somewhere that didn't smell like hospital antiseptic and death. The leaves were turning, gold and crimson, against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. And he hated every beautiful second of it. She should have been there to see it. They'd walked these trails every fall for 42 years, her hand in his, arguing about whether the maples or the oaks put on the better show. Now he walked alone, and the silence was a living thing that pressed against his ears until he thought he'd go mad from it. That's when he heard the sound. Not a cry exactly. More like a wet, desperate rasping that came from somewhere off the main trail, back in the thick undergrowth where the old growth pines blocked out most of the light. Caleb had almost kept walking. Almost. But there was something in that sound that spoke of suffering, and even hollowed out as he was, he couldn't just leave it. He found the trap 30 yards into the underbrush, hidden beneath a scatter of leaves and pine needles. A leg hold, the kind that had been illegal in North Carolina for a decade, but still showed up in the woods, set by men who didn't care about laws or seasons or anything except the price a good pelt could fetch. The Bobcat kitten couldn't have been more than 4 months old, small enough that the trap's jaws had caught its entire back leg and part of its hip. The steel had bitten deep, crushing bone and tearing muscle, and the animal had fought so hard to escape that it had worn the fur completely off its other 3 legs, rubbed them raw and bloody against the ground. It should have been dead already. Should have bled out or died from shock or been found by something bigger and hungrier. But it was still alive. Still fighting, even though its eyes had started to glaze over and its breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. Caleb knelt beside it, and the kitten tried to snarl at him, tried to be fierce and dangerous even as it lay dying. The sound it made was pitiful, a broken imitation of the threat its instincts demanded. "Easy now," Caleb heard himself say. Easy. He knew what he should do. The humane thing. The practical thing. Put the animal out of its misery with a quick blow to the skull, then reset the trap and wait for whoever had set it to show up so he could give them a piece of his mind. Or better yet, just take the trap and throw it in the deepest part of the river. But he didn't do the humane thing. Instead, he shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped it around the kitten's head so it couldn't bite him, then worked the trap's jaws open with a strength he didn't know he still possessed. The leg came free with a wet sound that made his stomach turn, and the kitten went limp in his arms, either unconscious or dead, he couldn't tell which. He was carrying it back toward the trail, already trying to remember if Doc Henderson still made house calls for emergencies, when a voice stopped him cold. "That's my property you're stealing, old man." Silas emerged from behind a massive oak, his rifle cradled in his arms with the casual ease of someone who'd been born holding one. He was maybe 40, all ropey muscle and cold eyes, with the kind of face that looked mean even when it smiled. Caleb knew him by reputation, knew he ran trap lines all through these mountains despite the laws, knew he'd served time downstate for assault and come back meaner than when he'd left. "This isn't property," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the fear that had started to crawl up his spine. "It's a living creature, and what you did to it is illegal." Silas spat tobacco juice onto the leaves. "What I did to it is make a catch, and that catch is worth maybe $300 to the right buyer once I cure the pelt. So you can hand it over nice and peaceful, or we can have a problem." The kitten stirred in Caleb's arms, a faint movement that might have been its last breath or might have been the start of a fight to live. Something in that tiny movement decided things for Caleb, crystallized a choice he didn't know he'd been making. "We already have a problem," he said quietly. Silas's smile went sharp. "Old-timer, I don't think you understand your situation here." "I understand it fine. I understand you're breaking about 4 different laws. I understand that leg holds have been banned in this county since before you were born. And I understand that if you point that rifle at me, you're going to add assault to the list of charges I'm filing soon as I get back to town." For a long moment, they stood there, measuring each other. Caleb could see Silas doing the math, weighing the value of a damaged kitten against the hassle of dealing with the law. The calculation played out across his face, and Caleb knew with cold certainty which way it was going to fall. Silas raised the rifle. Caleb didn't think. He just moved, shifting the bundle in his arms and reaching for the 12-gauge he'd been carrying since Sarah got sick, the one he took on every walk now because sometimes the world felt too heavy and too empty, and at least if a bear showed up, he'd have an excuse to use it. The barrel came up smooth and steady, years of muscle memory overriding fear, and suddenly it was Silas looking down the wrong end of a gun. "You're not taking this animal," Caleb said. And his voice had gone flat and cold, had become the voice of a man with nothing left to lose. "You're going to turn around and walk away, and you're going to pull every trap you've got in these woods. And if I ever catch you on my property again, we're going to have a conversation you won't enjoy." Silas stared at him, and something ugly moved behind his eyes. "This ain't over, old man. Not by a long shot." "No," Caleb agreed. "I don't expect it is." They stood like that for another heartbeat. Then Silas lowered his rifle and stepped back, his face promising violence, deferred but not forgotten. He melted back into the woods, and Caleb listened until he couldn't hear footsteps anymore, before letting his hands start shaking. The kitten chose that moment to make a sound, weak and thready, and Caleb looked down at the blood soaking through his jacket, at the impossible task of keeping this wild thing alive. "What the hell have I done?" he whispered to the empty woods. But he already knew. He'd picked a fight he probably couldn't win, had made an enemy of a dangerous man, and all for a creature that would almost certainly die before morning. He'd done it because Sarah would have. And maybe, just maybe, that was reason enough. The workshop became a hospital, then a home, then something Caleb didn't have words for. He'd cleared Sarah's quilting table without thinking, swept aside the half-finished projects she'd never complete, and laid the kitten on the clean wood like it was an altar. The leg was worse than he'd thought, crushed so badly that bone fragments showed white through the torn muscle. And the infection had already started, turning the edges of the wound an angry red. Doc Henderson had come, taken one look, and shaken his head. "Caleb, even if this were a dog, I'd tell you to let it go. But a wild animal, its whole nature is going to fight you. The kindest thing is a bullet. No, it's suffering. Then help me stop the suffering. Please, Tom, just tell me what to do." The doctor had sighed, set down his bag, and started pulling out supplies. "You're going to need antibiotics, but I can't prescribe them for a bobcat. Best I can do is show you how to clean the wound and give you some pointers. After that, you're on your own, and I'm telling you right now, this is probably going to end badly." It should have ended badly. The kitten fought him every time he changed the dressing, fought with a desperate strength that seemed impossible for something so small and damaged. It wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, just lay on Sarah's quilting table with its eyes half closed, breathing in shallow gasps that Caleb counted through the endless nights. On the third day, he started talking to it, not because he thought it would understand, not because he expected it to respond, but because the silence in the workshop was the same silence that filled the house, the same silence that had swallowed his life whole when Sarah's breathing finally stopped, and he couldn't bear it anymore. "I don't know what I'm doing," he told the dying creature. "I never knew what I was doing. Sarah was the smart one, the one who could fix things. I just worked with wood because wood makes sense. You cut it, you shape it, you sand it smooth, and it becomes what you want it to be." He mixed a poultice from golden seal and echinacea, plants Sarah had grown in her garden for her teas and tinctures, following instructions she'd written in her careful handwriting in a notebook he'd been too afraid to open until now. His hands shook as he applied it to the wound, but the kitten barely reacted, too weak even to fight anymore. "People don't work that way," Caleb continued, his voice rough. "People are messy. They get sick when they shouldn't. They leave when you need them most. And there's nothing you can do about it, no matter how hard you try or how much you love them." On the fifth night, Caleb fell asleep in his chair beside the table, exhausted from 48 hours of watching for any sign of improvement. He dreamed of Sarah, of her hands gentle on his face, of her voice telling him to hold on just a little longer. He woke to something rough against his palm. The kitten was licking his hand, its tongue like sandpaper, its eyes finely clear and focused. It was still impossibly weak, still damaged maybe beyond repair, but it was awake and aware and, against every reasonable expectation, alive. Caleb laughed, a sound he hadn't made since the funeral, and felt something crack in his chest that had been frozen solid for months. "Well," he said to the small creature, "I guess we're both too stubborn to die." The recovery took weeks. The leg healed crooked, set itself at an angle that would have crippled a domestic animal. But the kitten adapted with a resilience that left Caleb in awe. It learned to walk on 3 legs when the 4th hurt too much, learned to leap and climb despite the injury, driven by an instinct to survive that seemed to feed off Caleb's determination to keep it alive. He named it Echo because that's what it felt like. A reflection of something he'd lost, a sound coming back to him from across an impossible distance. The workshop became their shared space. Caleb would work on his furniture commissions, the lathe spinning out table legs and chair backs, while Echo watched from Sarah's quilting table, those amber eyes tracking every movement. At night, when the loneliness got too heavy, Caleb would talk, and Echo would listen with an attention that felt almost human. "I know I have to let you go eventually," he admitted one evening, his hands working a piece of cherry wood by lamplight. "You're wild. You belong out there, not in here with a broken old man. But not yet. Not until you're strong enough." Echo made a sound, low and rumbling, that might have been agreement or protest or nothing more than indigestion. It was during those long nights that Caleb carved the whistle. He didn't plan it, just found himself working the wood one evening while Echo slept, his hands moving through patterns Sarah had taught him, creating something that served no practical purpose, but felt necessary all the same. The whistle was small, no bigger than his thumb, carved from mountain ash and polished until it gleamed. When he blew into it, no sound came out, at least nothing human ears could detect. But Echo's head came up immediately, ears swiveling toward him, eyes bright with curiosity. Caleb blew it again, and Echo padded over, moving with that strange three-legged gait that somehow never slowed her down. She pressed against his leg, and he ran his hand through her fur, feeling the steady drum of her heartbeat. "Just between us," he said softly. "Our secret frequency. So if you ever get lost, you can find your way home." He didn't let himself think about what home meant anymore, or whether he was talking about the workshop or something larger. He just blew the whistle again and watched Echo respond, and for the first time since Sarah died, the silence didn't feel quite so crushing. Outside, winter was coming. Inside, two damaged creatures were learning how to be alive again. And in the darkness beyond the workshop's circle of lamplight, something watched and waited and remembered the taste of old grudges. The fire came on a February night when the temperature had dropped below zero and the stars looked close enough to touch. Caleb woke to Echo's warning, a sound he'd never heard her make before. A deep, repetitive growl that spoke of threat and fury. He was out of bed before his brain caught up, stumbling through the dark house in his long johns, following Echo as she bounded toward the back door, her scarred leg barely slowing her down. The workshop was burning. Orange light flickered through the pine trees, painting the snow in shades of hell. Caleb ran, his bare feet sinking into the frozen drifts, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, Echo kept pace. Her growls turned to something sharper, more urgent. He was 50 yards away when he saw Silas, silhouetted against the flames, a gas can in one hand, and that familiar cold smile on his face. "Told you this wasn't over, old man." The workshop was already half gone, the dry wood feeding the fire with terrible efficiency. Flames climbed the walls and licked at the roof, consuming everything Caleb had built, every piece he'd been working on, every tool he'd inherited from his father. The heat hit him like a physical wall, drove him back even as he tried to move forward. "Sarah's things are in there," Caleb heard himself say, his voice breaking. "Her quilts, her notebooks. Should have thought about that before you crossed me." Silas tossed the empty gas can aside. "Should have given me what was mine." Caleb looked at Echo, who stood rigid beside him, every muscle coiled tight. She'd grown over the past months, had filled out into something powerful and dangerous. But she was still young, still learning what she was capable of. And Silas had his rifle. "Just go," Caleb said quietly. "You've made your point. Just go." But Silas wasn't finished. He raised the rifle, pointed it at Echo with the casual certainty of a man who'd killed many things and felt nothing about it. "I'll go, soon as I collect what's owed." The shot never came. Echo moved like liquid lightning, faster than Caleb's eyes could track, a blur of tawny fur that closed the distance between them before Silas could squeeze the trigger. She hit him low and hard, her scarred leg driving up into his gut with all the force of her wild nature finally unleashed. And the rifle went spinning into the snow. Silas went down cursing, trying to protect his throat. But Echo wasn't going for the kill. She was driving him back, away from Caleb, away from the burning workshop. Her snarls filling the night with a promise of violence held barely in check. Caleb ran toward the workshop, knowing it was foolish, knowing the structure was already lost, but unable to stop himself. He had to try, had to save something. He made it through the door before the first beam fell. The interior was an inferno, the heat so intense it stole the breath from his lungs. He could see Sarah's quilting table, half collapsed, the fabric already ash. Could see the lathe where he'd spent countless hours warping in the heat. Could see the small shelf where he'd kept the wooden whistle, the one that only Echo could hear. He lunged for it, grabbed it even as the shelf disintegrated, and that's when the ceiling beam came down. It caught him across the shoulders, driving him to his knees, pinning him under what felt like the weight of the whole burning sky. He tried to push up, tried to crawl, but his body wouldn't respond, and the smoke was filling his lungs with poison. And somewhere very far away, he could hear Echo making sounds he'd never heard before. Sounds of panic and loss. Then she was there, inside the flames, her fur smoking, her eyes wild. She grabbed his jacket in her teeth and pulled, her scarred legs somehow finding purchase on the burning floor, her strength defying everything Caleb knew about physics and possibility. The beam shifted. His shoulders came free. She dragged him backward, inch by impossible inch, toward the rectangle of cold air that marked the door. They made it out as the roof collapsed, the workshop folding in on itself in a shower of sparks that rose into the frozen sky like prayers. Caleb lay in the snow, coughing up smoke and ash, his back screaming with pain, and Echo stood over him, her sides heaving, patches of her fur singed black. Silas was gone, had fled while Echo was busy saving the man who'd saved her. But his laughter drifted back through the trees, cruel and satisfied. Caleb watched his workshop burn, watched Sarah's last tangible pieces turn to ash and smoke, and felt something inside him break that had nothing to do with the beam that had crushed his shoulders. He'd brought this on himself by saving Echo, by making an enemy of Silas, by refusing to let wild things stay wild. Echo pressed against him, her damaged leg trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She'd risked everything to pull him from that fire, had run into hell itself because he was in danger. And Caleb understood with terrible clarity what that meant. As long as they were together, she would never truly be wild. She would always choose him over her own survival, would always run toward danger instead of away from it. And eventually, that choice would get her killed. He wrapped his arms around her neck and held on, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and made a decision that felt like dying. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her singed fur. "I'm so sorry, but I have to let you go." Echo's rumble changed, became something almost like a question, and Caleb closed his eyes against the tears that had started falling. Tomorrow. He would do it tomorrow, before he lost his nerve, before Silas came back with something worse than fire. He would save her the only way he had left, by breaking both their hearts. The mountain peak stood above the tree line, where the wind cut like razors, and nothing human had any business being in February. Caleb climbed it anyway, Echo following close behind, both of them moving through snow that came up past their knees. His back still screamed from where the beam had caught him, and every breath felt like broken glass in his lungs, but he kept climbing. Had to. This place was far enough from civilization that no hunter would bother. Remote enough that Echo could disappear into true wilderness and never have to see another human being again. She could survive here. Would survive here if he could just make her understand that she had to. They reached the summit as the sun broke over the eastern ridges, painting the valley below in shades of gold and shadow. Caleb stood there, the wooden whistle heavy in his pocket, and tried to find words for what he had to do. Echo sat beside him, her amber eyes watching his face with that unsettling intelligence, that awareness that went beyond what any wild thing should possess. She knew something was wrong. Had known since he'd loaded her into the truck before dawn. Had known from the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't speak except to give directions. "This is it," Caleb said finally, his voice cracking in the cold air. "This is where you stay." He pulled the whistle from his pocket, held it up so she could see it. The wood caught the sunrise, gleamed like something precious, something worth keeping. Echo's eyes tracked it, her ears swiveling forward. Then Caleb raised it above his head and brought it down hard against a boulder. The whistle shattered, pieces of mountain ash scattering across the snow like broken promises. Echo jerked back, a sound escaping her throat that was almost a whine, almost a question. "No more," Caleb said. And his voice had gone hard, had taken on the tone he'd used on Silas when he'd raised the shotgun. "No more following. No more waiting. You're wild, Echo. You're supposed to be wild." He picked up a stone, felt its weight in his palm. His hand shook, but not from the Parkinson's that wouldn't start for another decade. This was a different kind of tremor, the kind that came from doing something unforgivable because it was the only thing left to do. He threw the stone, didn't aim for her, would never aim for her, but close enough that it kicked up snow near her paws, close enough to startle her back a few steps. "Go on," he said, his voice getting louder, getting cruel. "Get out of here. I don't want you. Never wanted you. You were just something to do, something to fill the time. And now I'm done." Echo stood her ground, her head lowered, confusion and hurt written across every line of her body. Caleb threw another stone, then another, each one landing closer, each one accompanied by words he'd never said to any living thing. "You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing but a burden, a broken thing that should have died in that trap. I should have let you die." The lies tasted like poison, but he kept going, kept throwing stones and shouting until his throat was raw. He picked up a branch, waved it at her like a weapon, and Echo finally backed away, finally showed the first signs of fear. "That's right," Caleb said, and he was crying now, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Be afraid. Be smart. Stay away from people. Stay away from me. And maybe you'll live long enough to have cubs of your own, to be what you were meant to be." Echo took another step back, then another, and Caleb saw the exact moment when something broke in her eyes, when hurt transformed into understanding that the bond between them had been severed. She made a sound, low and mournful, that carried across the mountain and made Caleb's heart crack wider. "Go," he whispered, no strength left for shouting. "Please, Echo, just go." She held his gaze for one more endless moment, her amber eyes reflecting the sunrise and something deeper, something that looked like forgiveness for a betrayal she didn't understand. Then she turned, that scarred leg moving with the grace she'd learned through pain, and disappeared into the morning mist that clung to the mountain's face. Caleb stood there until he couldn't feel his feet anymore, until the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the mist and show him an empty wilderness stretching in every direction. He gathered up the pieces of the broken whistle with numb fingers, held them in his palm like fragments of his own shattered heart. He'd saved her. That's what he told himself on the long drive home, on the weeks that followed when he'd catch himself listening for her footsteps, for her low rumble of greeting. He'd saved her from Silas, from the danger that came with being near a man who made enemies, from a life of depending on someone who would eventually die and leave her alone. He'd saved her, and the cost was only everything that had made the last year bearable. The workshop ashes grew cold. The insurance check came and went, used to rebuild something smaller, more practical, less full of memories. Caleb went back to work, went back to his quiet life, went back to being the hermit the town whispered about. But sometimes, on nights when the wind came from the north, he thought he heard something in the darkness beyond his windows. A sound that might have been a branch scraping or might have been something else. Something wild keeping watch over a man who'd driven it away for its own good. He never went to check. Never blew the whistle he'd carefully glued back together and hidden in a drawer he never opened. Some things, once broken, were meant to stay that way. Or so he told himself, for 12 long years. Until a blizzard brought the past crashing through a diner window and proved that some bonds, no matter how deeply buried, never really break at all. 12 years had a way of taking everything that was solid and turning it to dust. Caleb's hands shook now, not from cold or fear, but from the Parkinson's that had crept up on him like Silas through the woods, patient and inevitable. The diagnosis had come 3 years ago, delivered by a neurologist who was young enough to be his granddaughter and spoke in the kind of soft, careful tones people used around the dying. "It's progressive," she'd said, as if that word meant anything to a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. "We can manage the symptoms for a while, but eventually you'll need more care than you can provide for yourself." Eventually had arrived faster than anyone predicted. The simple things went first. Buttoning shirts, tying shoes, holding a coffee cup without spilling half of it down his front. Then came the bigger things, the losses that cut deeper. He couldn't work the lathe anymore, couldn't trust his hands to hold a chisel or guide a saw. The commissions dried up, and with them went the last thread connecting him to the person he used to be. His neighbors, the few who bothered to check on him at all, started using words like assisted living and memory care, speaking around him like he'd already lost his mind along with his motor control. He hadn't. His mind was sharp as ever, trapped inside a body that was systematically betraying him. And that might have been the cruelest part. The house felt too big and too empty. Every room an echo chamber for memories he'd spent 12 years trying to bury. Sarah's reading chair still sat by the window, though the upholstery had faded to ghost colors. The rebuilt workshop stood behind the house, its tools gathering dust because Caleb's hands couldn't hold them steady enough to matter. He'd become the thing he'd always feared, the helpless old man who needed others to survive. And the weight of that realization pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. The lawyer had come by on a Tuesday, all polished shoes and sympathetic smiles, carrying papers that would sign away the last piece of land Caleb owned. The offer was fair, probably more than fair, from a developer who wanted to turn the property into vacation cabins for rich people from Charlotte, who thought roughing it meant spotty cell service. "It's enough to cover a very nice facility," the lawyer said, sliding the contract across Caleb's kitchen table. "One of those places with activities and social interaction. You'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, nursing staff on call. Much better than struggling out here alone." Caleb looked at the papers with their clean legal language that basically said he was giving up, admitting defeat, accepting that the life he'd built was over, and what came next was just managed decline until the lights went out. His hands shook as he picked up the pen. "There's a spot available starting next month," the lawyer continued. "We just need your signature and we can get the process moving." Next month. 4 weeks to pack up 73 years, to decide what was worth keeping and what could be thrown away, to close the door on this house and these woods and never come back. 4 weeks to become someone who lived in a facility with activities and social interaction, who ate meals he didn't cook and followed a schedule he didn't set. 4 weeks to disappear into the kind of invisible old age where nobody remembered who you used to be. The pen touched paper. Caleb's signature came out shaky and barely legible, his own name rendered foreign by the tremor he couldn't control. The lawyer witnessed it, slid the papers back into his briefcase, and left with promises about making this transition as smooth as possible. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. The house creaked and settled around him, full of sounds he'd stopped hearing years ago but which now seemed loud and insistent. He got up, moved through the dark rooms with a careful shuffle that had replaced his old confident stride, and found himself at the window that looked out toward the mountains. The moon was nearly full, painting the snow-covered peaks in silver. Somewhere up there was the place he'd taken Echo, the place where he'd shattered the whistle and driven away the only thing that had made him want to keep living after Sarah died. He wondered if she was still alive, if bobcats even lived 12 years in the wild. Probably not. Probably she'd found a mate, had cubs, lived the life she was meant to live, and died the way wild things died, quickly and without fuss. Probably she'd forgotten all about the old man who'd saved her and betrayed her in the same breath. But standing there in the moonlight, with his hands shaking and his future reduced to a room in a facility, Caleb let himself imagine something different. Let himself imagine that somewhere in those mountains, Echo still remembered, still waited, still kept watch over the man who'd let her go. It was a foolish thought, the kind of magical thinking that had no place in the practical world of signed contracts and nursing facilities. But it was all he had left, and he held on to it like a drowning man holds onto driftwood. 3 days later, the blizzard warning came through on the radio. The biggest storm in a decade, they said. People should stock up on supplies, stay off the roads, prepare for power outages. Caleb looked at his empty refrigerator, at the pills he'd forgotten to take, at the house that was already sold, even if the papers hadn't finished processing. He thought about the diner, about hot coffee and other people's voices, about being somewhere that wasn't this hollow shell of memories. He thought about fate and second chances, and whether the universe bothered with either one. Then he put on his coat, climbed into his truck, and drove toward town through the first swirling flakes of snow, following an instinct he didn't understand, of us toward an ending he couldn't have predicted. Some appointments, it turned out, were bigger than lawyers or contracts or the measured decline into old age. Some appointments were written in scars and stars and the unbreakable bonds between broken things. The diner had gone quiet after the initial shock wore off, everyone watching as Caleb slowly stood, his joints protesting, Echo rising with him like a shadow made flesh. The trooper still had his hand near his weapon, uncertain, while the other patrons pressed themselves against the far wall. "I'm taking her home," Caleb said simply, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from no longer caring what anyone thinks. "Sir, that's a wild animal, a dangerous one." The trooper gestured at the shattered window, at the blood on the floor. "I can't just let you walk out of here with it. Her name is Echo." Caleb's hand rested on the bobcat's head, and she leaned into his touch. "And she came through a blizzard to find me. I'm not turning her away again." The trooper opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to really see what he was looking at. An old man whose hands shook with disease, a wild creature who'd crossed impossible distances, and something passing between them that had nothing to do with logic or law or any kind of sense that could be written into a regulation manual. 20 minutes, he said finally. Then I'm calling animal control. Whatever you need to do, you do it fast. Caleb nodded. He didn't have a coat anymore, had left it at home in his confusion. But it didn't matter. Echo pressed against his leg as they walked out into the blizzard, her warmth bleeding through his thin flannel. And somehow, that was enough. The wind hit them like a wall. But Caleb knew these roads, knew every turn, even in whiteout conditions. His truck was where he'd left it, already half buried in snow. He opened the passenger door, and Echo jumped in without hesitation, settling on the bench seat like she'd been doing it all her life. The drive home took forever, and no time at all. The world had narrowed to the tunnel of his headlights, to the weight of Echo beside him, to the knowledge that this was borrowed time, that whatever came next would be an ending. The house appeared through the snow like a memory, dark and cold because he'd left without thinking to leave lights on. Caleb killed the engine but didn't move, just sat there with his hands on the wheel, feeling them shake. "I don't know why you came back," he said to Echo, who watched him with those amber eyes. "But I'm glad you did. Even if it's just for tonight." She made that rumbling sound, the one that lived somewhere between contentment and sorrow. And Caleb felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent 12 years believing he'd done the right thing, that sending her away had saved her life. But looking at her now, seeing the scars she'd accumulated, the notch in her ear from some fight he hadn't been there to prevent, the slight gray around her muzzle that matched his own, he wondered. Maybe he hadn't saved her at all. Maybe he'd just condemned them both to 12 years of unnecessary loneliness. He was reaching for the door handle when he saw the other truck. Parked up the road, lights off, just a darker shape against the dark. But Caleb knew that truck would have known it anywhere. Silas had been waiting. Of course he had. Men like Silas never forgot, never forgave. And 12 years was nothing when hatred ran deep enough. He'd probably been watching the house, had seen Caleb leave, had known exactly when to show up and finish what he'd started the night he burned the workshop. Echo sensed it before Caleb could speak, her body going rigid, a growl building in her chest that he felt through the truck's seat. She'd smelled him, recognized the scent of the man who'd set the trap, who'd started the fire, who represented every cruel thing humans could do to wild creatures. "Easy," Caleb said, though his own heart was racing. "Easy, girl." But there was nothing easy about what was coming. The driver's door of Silas's truck opened, and the man himself stepped out, older now but no less dangerous, a rifle cradled in his arms like an old friend. The scope caught what little light there was and threw it back like a promise. Caleb's mind raced through options. He could try to drive away, but the roads were already nearly impassable. He could go inside, lock the doors. But those were just wood and glass, no barrier at all to a man with a gun and patience. He could try to reason. But you couldn't reason with someone who'd spent 12 years nursing a grudge. Or he could do what Sarah would have done. What the man he used to be would have done, before age and disease had taught him to be small and afraid. He could stand his ground. Caleb opened the truck door and stepped out into the blizzard, Echo flowing out beside him, both of them moving toward the house, toward whatever ending Silas had planned. The snow was coming down so hard now that Silas was just a shape, a darkness against darkness. But the rifle was clear enough. "Been waiting a long time for this," Silas called out, his voice carrying over the wind. Knew you'd come back here eventually. Knew she would too. Animals are predictable that way. So are old men. Caleb kept walking, his boots crunching through the snow, echo matching his pace. The porch was 20 feet away. 15. 10. That pelt's worth 5,000 now. Silas continued. Endangered species, you see. Illegal to take one, which just drives the price up for collectors who don't care about legal. And that one, with that scar, that's a trophy. That's a story some rich man will pay extra to own. 5 feet from the porch, Caleb stopped, turned to face Silas directly, putting himself between the rifle and Echo. "You'll have to go through me first," he said quietly. Silas's laugh was ugly. "Old man, that's exactly what I'm planning to do." The rifle came up, and in that moment, Caleb understood that this was how it ended. Not in some sterile facility with nurses and activities, but here, in the snow, protecting the one thing he'd ever managed to save. It seemed right somehow. Seemed like the kind of ending a man could be proud of. But Echo had other plans. The gunshot split the night, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the howling wind, but the muzzle flash bright enough to burn after images into Caleb's vision. He felt the impact before the pain registered, a sledgehammer blow to his left shoulder that spun him halfway around and dropped him to one knee. The snow beneath him started turning red. But Echo was already moving. She'd launched herself the instant Silas's finger tightened on the trigger, reading the threat in his body language the way wild things do, responding with the kind of speed that made her a predator instead of prey. The distance between them vanished. 40 pounds of muscle and fury covering the ground in 3 bounds that barely touched the snow. Silas tried to swing the rifle around for a second shot, tried to track her movement. But Echo was too fast, too close, too driven by an instinct older than guns or hatred or anything human. She hit him low, her scarred back leg driving up with all the force of 12 years surviving in mountains that killed the weak and the slow. The rifle went flying, tumbling end over end, before disappearing into a snowdrift. Silas went down hard, and Echo was on him, jaws snapping inches from his throat, close enough that he could feel her breath, close enough to kill but holding back because somewhere in her wild brain she remembered the lesson Caleb had taught her that first night in the workshop. Strength without cruelty, power without murder. Caleb watched through a gray haze that was trying to pull him under, watched as Echo pinned Silas to the frozen ground, her teeth bared but not biting, her growl a continuous vibration that spoke of violence, barely restrained. Silas had gone perfectly still, his face pale with terror, finally understanding what it meant to be prey. "Echo," Caleb managed, his voice weak. "Enough." She didn't let go, but her growl changed pitch, became a question. "Let him go," Caleb said, each word costing him. "Let him see what mercy looks like, even if he never learned to show it himself." For a long moment, nothing moved except the falling snow. Then Echo stepped back, releasing Silas but keeping herself between him and Caleb. Her message clear. The man scrambled backward, slipping in the snow. His earlier confidence shattered into something that looked like shame. He ran, stumbled to his truck and tore out of there with his tires spinning, leaving the rifle behind, leaving his pride behind, leaving everything behind except the knowledge that he'd lost to the same creature he'd tried to destroy 12 years ago. Echo watched until the taillights disappeared, then turned back to Caleb, who'd slumped against the porch steps, his hand pressed to his shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding. The bullet had gone clean through, which was probably good, but he was losing blood fast. Could feel it soaking through his shirt, warm against skin that was getting colder by the second. Echo pressed against him, her rumble shifting to something higher, more desperate. She'd saved him from the fire once, but this was different. This was a kind of hurt her teeth and claws couldn't fix, couldn't drag him away from. "It's okay," Caleb whispered, his free hand finding her fur, gripping it like an anchor. "You did good, girl. You did so good." His vision was narrowing, the edges going dark, but he could still see her eyes, still see the same fierce intelligence that had recognized him in the diner, that had brought her through a blizzard to find him. Could still see the question there, the one she'd been asking since she came through that window. "Why did you send me away?" "I was wrong," he said, the words coming easier now that he'd stopped fighting them. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was just afraid. Afraid of losing you like I lost Sarah. Afraid of caring about something that could leave. But you never left, did you? You've been out there all this time, watching, waiting." Echo's rumble became almost a whimper, a sound he'd never heard her make, a sound that spoke of understanding and forgiveness and grief for all the years they'd wasted being apart. Caleb's hand was getting numb, the cold or the blood loss or both stealing sensation from his fingers. But he kept them buried in her fur, kept holding on. The snow was piling up around them, already covering his legs, turning the world into nothing but white and Echo's amber eyes and a peace he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. "Thank you," he said, so quiet it was almost just a breath. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for not forgetting." His eyes started to close, his body giving up the fight. And he felt Echo shift, felt her press her scarred leg against his chest, felt the steady beat of her wild heart against his failing one. Above them, the blizzard raged on. But in that small space between the old man and the Bobcat, everything was still. Everything was right. The trooper found them 20 minutes later, his SUV fighting through snow that was already 2 feet deep and rising. He called for an ambulance, knowing it wouldn't get through, called for a helicopter, knowing it couldn't fly in this weather. He stood there in the whiteout, watching a wild animal refuse to leave a dying man's side, and felt something shift in his understanding of what was possible. Echo wouldn't let him near it first. Her body draped across Caleb's chest like a living blanket, her eyes daring the trooper to try. It wasn't until he radioed for a wildlife officer, until someone arrived who knew how to speak the language of wild things, that she finally, reluctantly, moved aside. They loaded Caleb into the back of the SUV, and Echo stood in the snow, watching, that scarred leg trembling with exhaustion or emotion or both. The trooper expected her to run, to disappear back into the mountains where she belonged. But she didn't run. She followed the SUV as far as she could, her tawny form visible in the taillights until the snow finally swallowed her. And even then, the trooper swore he could feel her watching, keeping vigil over the man who'd saved her and sent her away. And in the end, given her one last chance to return the favor. Caleb died 3 days later, not from the gunshot, but from pneumonia that set in during those hours he'd spent bleeding in the snow. The doctors said his body had just given up, that between the Parkinson's and the blood loss and the exposure, there was nothing left to fight with. But the nurses whispered about something else, about how peaceful he'd looked at the end, about the smile on his face that suggested he'd found something worth holding on to in those final moments. The lawyer came to the hospital on the second day, papers in hand, expecting to finalize the property sale. Instead, he found a handwritten will on the bedside table, dated the night of the blizzard, written in Caleb's shaking script, but legally binding all the same. What it said changed everything. The land wasn't going to developers. The house, the workshop, the 70 acres of forest that backed up against wilderness, All of it was being placed into a conservation trust. Not just any trust, but one with very specific conditions. No hunting, no trapping, no human interference beyond basic trail maintenance and wildlife monitoring. And the trust administrator was someone nobody had expected. Mark Stevens got the call on a Tuesday morning while he was reviewing case files in his Charlotte law office. He was 34, successful, engaged to be married, and had no memory of the day Caleb had saved his life when he was 7 years old, wandering lost in those same woods during a family camping trip. But his mother remembered, had told him the story 100 times, about the old hermit who'd found her son half frozen and carried him 3 miles to safety. The will was very clear. Mark was to oversee the creation of the Caleb and Sarah Whitmore Wildlife Sanctuary, funded by the life insurance policy Caleb had maintained for 40 years and never cashed in. The money was enough, if managed carefully, to run the sanctuary for decades, maybe longer. "Why me?" Mark asked the executor, a paralegal who'd known Caleb from church. "I'm a corporate lawyer. I don't know anything about wildlife conservation." The executor handed him a letter, sealed in an envelope with Mark's name written on it in that same shaking script. Mark opened it with hands that weren't quite steady and read words that had been written by a dying man who somehow knew exactly what he was doing. "You don't remember me, but I remember you. You were just a boy, lost and scared, and I found you before the mountain could take you. I saw something in you that day, a brightness that shouldn't be wasted on boardrooms and billable hours. Sarah and I never had children, but if we had, I would have wanted them to be like you. Smart, kind, someone who understands that some things matter more than money. This land saved me when I thought I couldn't be saved. Now I'm trusting you to save it. Make sure the wild things have a place to be wild. Make sure no one sets traps in these woods again. And if you ever see a bobcat with a lightning scar on her back leg, you let her be. She's earned her peace." Mark read the letter 3 times, then called his fiancée and told her their summer vacation plans had changed. They were going to North Carolina. The sanctuary took 6 months to establish. Mark worked with wildlife biologists, forestry experts, and conservation groups, transforming Caleb's vision into something real and lasting. They built a small visitor center where the old workshop had stood, filled it with displays about the local ecosystem and the importance of predator preservation. They established monitoring programs, set up trail cameras, and created educational materials for schools. But the real magic happened in the forest itself, in the places humans rarely went, where the old-growth pines still stood and the mountain streams ran clear and cold. Echo had vanished after that night, disappeared into the wilderness as completely as if she'd never existed. The wildlife officers searched, expecting to find her dead or dying from her own injuries. But they found nothing. Just tracks that led deep into the sanctuary land, and then faded like smoke. Spring came, then summer. Mark made regular trips to check on the sanctuary's progress, usually bringing his fiancée along, teaching her the names of birds and trees, learning to love these mountains the way Caleb had. They were there on a warm June evening, standing on the porch of Caleb's old house, when Mark remembered the other thing the will had mentioned. In the drawer of Caleb's nightstand, wrapped in soft leather, he'd found a wooden whistle, repaired at some point, the cracks visible but the pieces held together with careful glue work and what looked like love. There was a note tucked beside it, written in Sarah's handwriting instead of Caleb's, dated years before her death. "For when you need to call the wild things home." Mark pulled the whistle from his pocket now, held it up to the fading light, and felt foolish. It was just a piece of wood, probably didn't even work anymore, and certainly couldn't do what Caleb's letter had hinted it might. But standing there on the porch, looking out at the forest that was already healing, already becoming wild again, Mark thought about faith and legacy and the things we leave behind. He brought the whistle to his lips and blew. Nothing. No sound at all. At least nothing his ears could detect. His fiancée laughed, not unkindly, and Mark shrugged, ready to put the whistle away and forget about magical thinking. Then the forest moved. Echo came first, emerging from the tree line with that distinctive gait, her scarred leg marking her as surely as a signature. She'd grown heavier through the shoulders, filled out into full maturity, and there was gray scattered through her tawny coat that spoke of years survived and hardships endured. But she wasn't alone. Behind her came 3 younger bobcats, lean and cautious, their eyes bright with the wariness that kept wild things alive. Her cubs, nearly grown now, moving with the same fluid grace their mother had learned to reclaim. They spread out across the clearing, investigating this new scent, these new humans, with careful curiosity. And behind them, from different parts of the forest, came more. A pair of bobcats Mark didn't recognize, probably Echo's mate and his sibling. Another female with 2 half-grown kittens, an old male, scarred and battle-worn. One by one they appeared, drawn by something Mark couldn't hear, but that called to them all the same. Drawn by the whistle, or by the promise of safety it represented, or by something even simpler than that. The knowledge passed somehow from Echo to her offspring and to the others, that this land was different now. This land was home. Mark stood frozen, the whistle still pressed to his lips, and watched as the clearing filled with wild things that should have been invisible, that should have scattered at the first hint of human presence. But they didn't scatter. They gathered, patient and watchful, and Mark understood with sudden clarity what Caleb's legacy actually was. Not just the land, not just the money or the legal protections or the sanctuary designation. It was this moment of trust between human and wild. This fragile promise that some places could still be safe, that some bonds transcended species and reason, and everything the rational world said was impossible. Echo sat at the edge of the tree line, that lightning scar visible even in the fading light, and looked at Mark with eyes that held echoes of Caleb's own gaze. Eyes that said, "Thank you, and goodbye, and remember us." Then she stood, turned, and led her family back into the forest, back into the sanctuary that bore the names of 2 people who'd understood something essential about love and loss and letting go. The other bobcats followed, melting into the shadows one by one, until the clearing was empty again, except for Mark and his fiancée and the whistle that had called them forth. "Did that just happen?" she whispered. Mark nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He looked down at the whistle, at the careful repairs Caleb had made to something he thought was broken beyond fixing, and understood finally what the old man had been trying to tell him. Nothing was ever truly broken if you loved it enough to try. No bond was ever truly severed if both sides remembered. And legacy wasn't about what you accumulated, but about what you protected, what you preserved, what you left behind for others to discover and wonder at. In the forest, hidden from human eyes, but they're all the same, Echo and her children moved through their territory, marking it as their own, teaching the next generation that this land was theirs by right and by gift. The lightning scar on Echo's leg caught the last rays of sunlight, a permanent reminder of where she'd come from and who had saved her. And in the years that followed, as the sanctuary grew and thrived, As more people came to walk its trails and marvel at its wildness, there were occasional reports of sightings. A bobcat with a distinctive scar, her offspring and their offspring, carrying forward her genetics and her story. A whole population of wild things thriving in a place that had been set aside just for them. Some called it conservation. Others called it luck or good management or the natural resilience of ecosystems when humans got out of the way. But Mark, who visited every year on the anniversary of Caleb's death, who stood on that porch and blew the whistle just to see who might answer, knew the truth. It was love. Simple and complicated and absolutely impossible. And somehow, against all odds, real. The kind of love that echoed across years and species and even death itself, proving that some bonds, once forged in blood and sacrifice and mutual survival, never really ended at all. They just changed shape, became something larger, something that outlived the individuals, and became instead a legacy written in paw prints and scars and wild things that knew, somehow, that they were safe, that they were home, that they were and always would be remembered. Some stories stay with you long after they're told. They settle into your heart like snow on a mountain peak, quiet and permanent and beautiful in ways that are hard to put into words. If Caleb and Echo's journey touched something in you today, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me what moment hit you hardest. Was it when Caleb found Echo in that trap? When he had to send her away? Or maybe that final reunion in the snow? And if you believe, like I do, that the best stories are the ones about loyalty, sacrifice, and bonds that refuse to break, then you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to sharing tales of the connections between humans and animals that defy explanation. Stories that remind us what really matters in this world. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another story. Because next time, I've got something special planned. Another tale of an unlikely friendship. Another journey that'll make you laugh and cry and remember why these connections matter so much. Until then, take care of each other. And if you've got an animal in your life who's changed you the way Echo changed Caleb, give them an extra scratch behind the ears tonight. They deserve it. See you in the next story.